And the whole reason that I wanted to use that image was precisely because this piece for Bach, it's his longest organ work, it's his most mystical organ work, and it's the piece where he goes through all of the chorales that correspond to the essentials of what he perceived to be the Christian faith. So it's his magnum opus for the organ. It's very spiritual and catechetical, and precisely because of that, it's like, well, what image is going to correspond to that? Because this piece literally covers everything, the baptism, like the Gloria. I mean, it's Christ's birth, his death, his resurrection. It's like the whole life of the Christian. It's like all put into music for Bach. So the only fitting image would be an image that's also an all-encompassing image that then also shows the fractal patterns of the music of the spheres. Your image is perfect for that.
This is Jonathan Pajot. Welcome to the Symbolic World. Hello, everyone. I am here with my friend Matthew Wilkinson. For those who do not know, Matthew is the one who arranged and composed and put together the Symbolic World opening, and so he got some people together and recorded the opening for us. He also did an outro for us, which kind of vanished with time. But he helped us out because at the outset we had these copyright issues with the intro. So Matthew said, "Hey, don't worry, I've got it." But the reason why we're here today is because Matthew has a new album out. It is a recording of Bach's organ works. And as you can see, there's a very interesting image on the cover, which is my image of everything that he used for the cover. So we've been friends for several years, and I thought it'd be a good opportunity to talk a little bit about the symbolism of music, and especially in Bach. So Matthew, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And so tell us, first of all, let's start with this. Tell us a little bit about what this is, what's going on with the album that you put out.
Sure. So the piece that I recorded is Bach's Klavierübung 3. So if you don't know what a Klavierübung is, that roughly translates from the German as to keyboard practice. So there were several composers, for example, Bach's predecessor in Leipzig, Johann Kuhnau, who would publish a work called the Klavierübung, meaning keyboard practice. And it would be a set of useful pieces that could be used for different reasons, perhaps liturgical or for entertainment, but those pieces would have a didactic function. So when people would get their copy of the Klavierübung, by practicing these pieces, it further helped build their technique and their understanding of music, and most importantly, their understanding of improvisation.
Okay.
And probably partially because Bach himself wasn't a university graduate and wasn't a professor, unlike a lot of the other composers who had positions as prestigious as his. He took multiple opportunities in writing compositions to showcase really his breadth and artistry and to sort of make his statement on certain musical topics. So for this, the Klavierübung, the keyboard practice, he ended up publishing all 4 volumes of it. And even though he had a good relationship with a local publisher, they thought that the music was a little bit too difficult, so he ended up having to fund the whole project himself. Part 1 is Bach's 6 keyboard partitas. Part 2 is the Italian Concerto and the French Overture. Part 3 is the organ mass, as it's known. It's the one piece that's solely for organ. And then part 4 is the Goldberg variations.
Oh, okay.
And so for part 3, it's really like the exposition on what a chorale treatment is. And so a chorale or a Lutheran hymn, like a German Lutheran hymn, would often be played before everyone would start singing. So the organist would play out the tune, everyone would hear the tune, and then they'd kind of know how to sing it.
Okay.
And so became this big tradition of taking a chorale melody and treating it in various ways. And so in this piece, Bach takes very specific, very influential chorales and treats them in all types of different ways. And in some sense, it's like his magnum opus on the chorale treatment. Mm-hmm. And the piece is extremely Trinitarian. It kind of goes through all of the basics of the Lutheran faith. And there's a ton of symbolism all tied up into this work itself.
Okay, so tell us
a little bit, and maybe we can delve a little more.
I mean, tell us a bit about that, because I don't understand that completely. I have, music is not something I understand super well. And so how can it be Trinitarian in it being musical? Like, what is it about the structures or how they set it up that makes it Trinitarian?
Yeah, so this piece specifically, it's 27 movements long. And so 27 matters because what is 27?
I don't know. What is 27?
It's 3 times 3 times 3.
Is it now? Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, 9 times 3 is 27. I was like, that's how I'm not very mathematical. So yeah, so 3 times 3 times 3. All right.
And so the piece begins and ends in the key of E flat major. And the key of E flat major, if you can read music, you'll know it has 3 flats. So, I guess it could be an A major, but that would have probably not been great. That would have had, 3 sharps, but it's an E flat major, so it has 3 flats.
Okay.
So there's a little bit of symbolism there, where you immediately see 3. And then the piece begins with a very famous prelude and ends with a very famous fugue. And both the prelude and the fugue are written in 3 sections. And so the beginning piece begins, it won't sound exactly the same on the piano, but I'll play a little just so you can kind of hear. Begins with this sort of motif. And if you've ever heard that style, it's the style of a French overture.
Okay.
So the French overture is what they would play when the king came in. Mm-hmm. So if you were listening to an opera in the theater and they start playing a French overture, it's a signal that the king is coming in.
Okay.
So immediately you see, oh, this is, representing God the King. Then the whole second section of the prelude, he goes... which is actually not very contrapuntal. It's actually more in the galant style, which is the style of CPE Bach, Bach's son. So it's the style of the son.
Okay.
Okay. Then he gets to the third section, and the third theme is... It's this long, flowing, rapid movement. So it seems as though it's either dancing or flying, like the dove, Holy Spirit. Some of these things are kind of on the nose, but you can see it.
Okay, all right.
It's for sure there, and he for sure thought about these things as he was creating it. Mm. And then the same thing happens when you get to the fugue. The fugue is called the St. Anne fugue because the melody resembles "O God, Our Help in Ages Past," which is the hymn tune called St. Anne. And the first style is an older style.
Okay.
That's called the Stile Antico. So it's the style of Palestrina. And then he gets into a little bit of a more modern style at the end. Not the end, but the second portion. So the second portion is... otherwise known as a Spielfuge, which is a little bit more of a Baroque style or modern style. And then the third section is a Jigfuge. So 3 distinct sections. The third section, more dancing, Jigfuge, definitely is something that he uses to portray the Holy Spirit. They're all in slightly different times. The first is in cut time, and the second is in 6/4, and the last is in 12/8. That's less relevant if you don't understand what that means, other than to know that they're proportional to each other, and there is a way in which each section of the fugue relates to the other section, and then he brings back all three subjects into the whole piece itself. So it's like one cohesive unit. There's a good argument that the E-flat fugue is perhaps the greatest fugue that Bach ever wrote, and that it sort of takes the instrumental fugue and the vocal fugue and combines them together in this masterpiece. And so the whole Klavierübung 3, the whole organ mass, is bookended by this prelude in E-flat in 3 sections, this fugue in E-flat in 3 sections, which show different styles, and then the inner movements follow the different German chorales. So there's a Kyrie, Christe, Kyrie, and he writes one setting for manuals only, then he writes another setting that incorporates the whole organ. Then he has the German Allein Gott in der Höhe, which is the German Gloria. So there's 3 different German Glorias, holy, 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 glory to God in the highest and on peace. And, there's some great, like if you listen to the recording, you can tell there's some interesting, you can tell he's text painting, interesting symbolism. So like the Fugetta on Allein Gott in der Höhe sei er. Sort of sounds like angels in a way. And he actually writes staccato markings, which more or less mean that the hierarchy of values that you superimpose upon regular articulation, you temporarily suspend when there are dots. So it's as though all of these angels are equal in these relatively jagged movements up and down, surrounding each other. And it's played super up high, and so you kind of hear the angels singing. And then he has 2 versions of these are the 10 Commandments, die sind die heiligen 10 Gebot. 2 versions of the Creed, wir glauben an einen Gott. 2 versions of the Vater Unser, the Lord's Prayer. And then he takes 3 distinct Lutheran hymns. He takes the Jesus Christus, unser Herr zum Jordan kam, which is Jesus coming to the Jordan. And important because it's one of the sacraments, especially for the Lutherans, it's the baptism. And then he has this Aus tiefer Not schrei ich zu dir, which is the German translation of Psalm 130, which was used as a confession. And he has this crazy movement called Jesus Christus unser Heiland, der von uns den Zorn Gottes fahn, which is Christ who saves us from the wrath of God. So, maybe scandalous to the Orthodox and penal substitution and all of that, but a great movement nonetheless. All
right. So help us think.
So all throughout this,
help us think through this, and so, like I said, so it seems like sometimes the meaning of the piece or the thing it's hinting at is in the structure itself. So there are a few times where you say, here are the types of sonorities that are happening. It's high up in the register. These sounds are kind of turning around each other. And so you get this sense of, like singing angels that are dancing maybe, or that are kind of turning. And so I see that. All right. Okay. I don't know if I completely hear it. I mean, I imagine it's also, you have to train yourself to start to hear this. But then there's some of the symbolism, which is actually extra musical. So for example, you say he's referencing the style of his own son. And so, that's not in the music itself. And so now the Trinitarian relationship is not, or this, the illusion is not in the structure of the music, but in its how it's contained in the world, or how it references other layers of meaning together. And so you think he was kind of going through all of these different types, or trying to allude in different ways to meaning in those? It's hard for me to think that way, because it looks a little disjointed to me.
Well, some of it is, context, in the sense of, if you lived in the time of Bach, you'd kind of catch some of the jokes, or, catch some of the allusions. In the same way, if you read a T.S. Eliot poem, well, I'm not sure anyone's ever understood just reading a T.S. Eliot poem, but, Yeah. You have to have all the commentary there.
The fact that if you watch, I don't know, even like a modern movie or something where someone is referencing a Tarantino movie, then you'll know, like you just know that that's what's happening, and it can be happening in all kinds of ways. It's just because you have that social connection. Whereas we've lost some of these capacities, let's say, or we don't know these traditions, and so it can look a little arbitrary to us.
Sure. Like if you watch, Interstellar, you can definitely see, oh, that's 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah, it's a reference to.
He's for sure throwing an allusion to Kubrick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, and I think so. There's some of that for sure. Like there are definitely things that it's helpful to kind of know the context behind, where like, oh, this style is more gallant, this style is more Palestrina. But if you lived in the 1700s and you went to church every week, and in between the scripture readings they were only singing Renaissance motets, then it would be easier to catch on to the fact of, oh, this style of counterpoint is a Renaissance motet. Whereas, now you go to church and you're not necessarily listening to Renaissance motets, so you might not catch the same illusion. But
and also we don't.
I think the music itself,
I was going to say we don't. I think we've lost musical literacy. Quite a few of us. We don't have those. We have these illusions visually. We can recognize visual illusions. We can recognize, meaning illusions. But we don't have that musical language anymore, right? Where we can listen to a music, let's say a symphony or a fugue or something, and we can say, oh, he's referencing something, and now he's commenting on something, but only through musical means.
Sure. I think with Bach especially, but also with later classical compositions, some of the differences, it's not only illusion. It's like the vocabulary and the makeup makes it so that there's always something to bite into. Sort of like the same with a really good movie. It's like if you knew Interstellar, you wouldn't have to know that it's making an allusion to 2001: A Space Odyssey to get it. In the same way, if you listen to the Prelude and Fugue in E flat, it's super majestic at the beginning. It's exciting, and you might not need to know all of the allusions to catch it. And probably because of the vocabulary that Bach uses, there is something that feels sacred about it. It's just natural to writing in this sort of contrapuntal style, and specifically Bach's style, who, almost everything Bach wrote was for the church. The majority of his compositions were made of, they were really cantatas, of which we've lost a significant portion of them. But he had cantatas for basically every Sunday of a multi-year liturgical cycle. And so almost everything he wrote was with scripture in mind. So it totally transforms his musical vocabulary. And I think there's something about like Baroque music itself, maybe more so than later music, which contains this music of the spheres, if you will.
Yeah, and why? Like, what is it? Because I feel that, like, when I listen to Bach, I like listening to the fugues particularly, and there's something right. I mean, for sure, there's something right. There's something of a hero's journey in the structure of the music that I can follow, that I can kind of attend to. There is this, you get this sense of an order, like a statement, something that is clear, and then you can see there's a play, there's like breathing in and out, and it kind of goes away and comes back and then finally it starts to reappear, and then you kind of see it clearly again, and it makes you kind of, so you have this sense of adventure and longing even, and of remembering, and then finally this coming back. And so for me, those types of structures are kind of easy to see why they are. They have that sense of the sacred in them. Like when you hear them, you feel like you're being carried, in a special way.
Hello, everyone. This is Annie Crawford inviting you to join me this January for a symbolic world reading of Till We Have Faces, the book C.S. Lewis calls far and away the best I've written. Till We Have Faces is Lewis's modern retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche, a mysterious tale of dark idolatry, classical enlightenment, and the shocking discovery of true religious vision. In our 4-week online course together, we'll explore what C.S. Lewis has to show us about the nature of myth, the dangers of love, the limits of reason, and the secrets of genuine reenchantment. This is a book, an author, and a class you won't want to miss.
And so tell us a bit about why contrapuntal music has that effect. What is it? What's happening to us?
Yeah, I think so. Let's take, for example, this fugue. It's a good example, the E-flat fugue, maybe just the first section.
Yeah.
So a lot of what there is to digest in a fugue is you have a subject, and a lot of the difficulty in composing a fugue is composing a really good subject. Then you need a countersubject, so something that corresponds to it. So,
all right, so give us the two in the fugue. Help us hear this. Like, so what is the subject in this fugue?
Sure. So in the first subject in the E-flat fugue is... So that's it. That's the first subject in the fugue. Now, then it repeats. So you could say that was in the tenor. Then it goes... But when it repeats, you have a counter subject on top of it. So I'll play both. So first, the subject. Now, subject again with counter subject. So the... is the counter subject, and you'll hear both of those come back in different places.
Okay.
I'll point out real quickly that when the second subject comes in right here, the notes are E flat, D, and G, and in German, E flat is called S, like you would say that's SDG, and he's saying Solo Dei Gloria right there.
What?
Yeah, he signs everything with Solo Dei Gloria, all glory be to God alone, and he's literally putting it in music right there. So at the very beginning of this fugue, he puts Solo Dei Gloria
to God. That's amazing.
Right there at the beginning. Sometimes he signs his name too, because in German, B flat is be or B, and B natural is Ha or H. And so every now and then, if you want to nerd out on this type of thing, you can search his music and you'll find, and that's his name, B-A-C-H.
That's hilarious.
And so sometimes that's sometimes it's totally in the music, and sometimes it's at very specific, interesting points in the music. Maybe where the golden mean is, for example. He plays all these kind of crazy jokes.
Okay, so and what's important is that the subject is one hand and the counter subject is the other hand, right?
Not necessarily. It's just another voice. That's the way to think of it.
Okay, it's a voice. All right, so it's two voices.
Because you could have a 6-part fugue in which everything is playing something, and you might have 2 subjects and a counter subject in one hand, and then a counter subject in another hand, and it can get very complicated. If you listen to the movement Aus tiefer Not on the CD, it's 6 parts, and so it's a 6-part fugue, and the pedal has 2 different parts at some times.
Wow!
And it's great on that organ because the winding is super old, and it's great to pull basically every stop on the organ. So the wind is struggling, and so it's as though the organ is sobbing itself.
It's out of
from
breath.
Deep distress, I cry to you. Have mercy on me.
The organ's out of breath, and it's like, have mercy on me, Lord. That's amazing. Yeah, actually, before you.
Yeah, and I think he knew it would be like that.
Oh yeah. So before you continue with these subject and counter subject, tell people about the organ, because we didn't mention it. The organ that you're recording, that you were able to play this on.
Yeah, so the organ I played on is the Trost organ in Waltershausen. So one thing I did when I went to do my master's in Germany is I tried to play at least 1 or 2 of every organ builder who Bach knew. And so the Schnickers, the Zilbermans, the Trost, so I tried to play at least 1 or 2 of each of those organs, so I really knew the sound that Bach had. And we know that Bach loved the organ builder Gottfried Trost because he dedicated another Trost organ in a nearby village in the Altenburg Schlosskirche. And when he was there, he did a couple things. One is he pulled a bunch of stops together to use as a solo stop, and evidently that caused a little bit of a ruckus because people were like, oh, you're not supposed to pull those together. And another thing that he did was he did a chorale or a hymn, and he kept transposing up on each verse. Something us organ players do every now and then that some people say, oh, that's cheesy, you shouldn't do that. But Bach did it, so if the master did it, it's totally fine.
Create that effect. We know what that effect feels like in some time. I remember when I was younger, you would get that. You know what they're trying to do. All right, so basically this organ was an organ, not the exact organ, but an organ, a type of organ that Bach himself would have played on, if I understand correctly.
Bach probably played this organ. So this organ, there's no technical record of him playing it, but he was in the area passing by, and the same builder built another organ in a nearby village, and he's for sure associated with that organ, so Bach probably played this organ. It's a Thuringian organ, so it's a little different than a lot of organs that Bach typically gets recorded on. So there's a lot of, really niche, unique features about it, like the way the mixture stops are slightly different. I mean, if you just listen to it and listen to other recordings of the same piece, then you'll be able to hear, oh, this is a really special organ. And this organ has lots of different color stops. So lots of 8-foot stops, lots of mutation stops.
I have no idea what any of that stuff means. I don't know what any of that means, Matthew. But it's okay. I'll pretend like I do. I'll be like, all the stops, all the color stops. It's cool to think that
in comparison to other organs, there's a lot of different timbres on this organ.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I know that more.
There's
I understand
a wider color palette.
More. All right, wider color palette. All right, cool. All right, so bring us back to how this works, like how the subject and counter subject play with each other, or how they come together.
Sure. So maybe we'll go through some of this fugue just so you can kind of see where the entrances are. We have the subject, then another entrance. This is faster than it goes, by the way. have what's called episodic material to take it to the next entrance. Then another entrance. Then another entrance. Then more episodic material to take it to the next entrance. And in the bass. So a lot of what's great about a fugue is it gives you something that you can grasp onto. Like, this is the repetition of the same thing. Sort of like seeing patterns fractally. It's like, oh, that's the same pattern. Now it's here. Now it's there. Then often in a fugue, it will go to a different place. So if everything is around E flat, it's centered right here, then it'll often go to the 5. So it'll start playing in that key, or maybe the 4. It'll start playing in the key of A flat. So where home is, where the pitch number 1, where the tonic is, where home is, will slightly shift, and then it always comes back home towards the end. At the end. So, I mean, that happens in every fugue. Every fugue has a subject, has a countersubject, it has episodic material, and it takes a journey to a place where home is a different key, sometimes 2 or 3 times, and then it always makes a return home. And it almost always begins with one voice, and then it ends with, beautiful, beautiful harmony all together. And so it takes all the different voices and it reconciles them, and then it makes sense of the whole journey. So it really is sort of this sense of like progression and return.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this process, like procession and return. Yeah, it's a Maximus. And so it has that Neoplatonic idea in it, and I mean, I can hear it. I know, because like I said, I don't totally understand it, but when I listen, especially to fugues, I get this very deep sense of satisfaction, and I don't completely understand it, but what you're explaining makes sense. But then you said sometimes there can be many subjects, and so would you bring them all together in the end as well, or would you go back to the first one? How does it usually play out?
Well, so like with Bach, there's always variations on the on what's typical, but typically with a fugue you have at least an entrance in each voice. So if it's a 4-voice fugue, there'll be 4 entrances of the fugue, and then it's typical that you go to 2 other keys and then you return home. And then there's what's called stretto, and stretto is where you'll have rather than, oh, here's the subject and now it's in another voice, they kind of layer on top of each other and they create this magnificent effect. Even though it's in the middle, you can hear a little bit of the effect of stretto right here in the middle of this first movement. So you'll hear. So here. So there's a little mini stretto where you had 3 subjects all coming in all on top of each other. Mm-hmm. And so generally, a lot of the times at the end of a fugue, you'll have that. So now they're all coming in more rapid succession. Then maybe there's some extra cadential stuff, some fluff at the end. But generally you have a stretto at some point, and usually towards the end of the fugue. So that's another integral part of a Baroque fugue. So, and there's like an implicit hierarchy there. There's there's the hierarchy of what the key is. So like you set a key, you come back to the same key after going somewhere else. The voices, they have like this interplay with each other, but I don't know. Does all of that make sense?
No, I mean it makes sense. It's it's obviously it's interesting, especially when you play it and we can kind of hear it happen together. And so this seems to be something very particular to the Baroque itself. Was there some, how can I say this? Was there something before the Baroque that had similar structures or that used similar patterns of these, you could, I guess, subjects that would play with countersubjects and resolve? Like, is that something that was completely new with the Baroque?
What the Baroque did is it sort of solidified what the rules for imitation were. So if you go back to the earliest of instrumental music, you'll have what's called imitation or canonic imitation. So you create something. But it wasn't solidified like you had to go to this key and then come back home, and you had to have this many iterations of a subject. I mean, all the rules that ended up becoming solidified that make what we kind of know as a fugue weren't in place, but you still had canonic imitation from very early, 1500s. So that the idea of imitation, you create a little melody and then it repeats in another voice or even in the same voice in a different way. That's been integral to Western classical music basically from its inception. The idea of in counterpoint too. I mean, from the very beginning, it's, what note sounds best with this note and how do we put them together?
And so what is that? Explain that. What is counterpoint? What do we mean when you use that word? What are we referring to?
Yeah, counterpoint is just, you have one line, it's the line that accompanies that line. It's the harmony that goes with it. Maybe anachronistic to use the word harmony, but it's another line that goes with it. So, I mean, the counter subject is counterpoint to the line. So that upper line is counterpoint. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it does make sense. I can kind of hear it. And so I'm interested, I'm kind of interested in the question of duality and how this use of duality in music, maybe talk a little bit about that and the idea of the in some ways the resolving ultimately, I think in the end of the dualities. Have some of the musical theorists or even the musicians themselves thought about in that term?
In the term of duality?
Well, when we talk about the idea of something like, heaven and earth, or the notion of identity and its reflection, or identity and its opposite, or, obviously good and evil, all of these things, it doesn't have to necessarily be good and evil, but it's just this idea that the world plays itself, between something like open and closed, between these dualities that we experience. If that is something that, I don't know if that seems to be explicitly part of the music, or this music particularly.
Yeah, you're making me think of just straight up consonance and dissonance. For example, the rules kind of shift back and forth in what consonances are allowed and what dissonances are allowed in composition, or what were typically done. But sort of a lot of what a fugue is it's taking the notes that don't work and then it's reconciling them to, its own pattern of being. You're also making me think, just thinking of duality. In the Baroque and even before, there seems to be a complex structure to the music, where you have multiple lines that are all working in harmony. So it's the reiteration of patterns all throughout. And then when you get to what is maybe the reaction to the Baroque, what comes immediately after, then even though you can still have multiple lines, it's not like you don't have multiple lines all going. You don't have counterpoint in the same way. It's as though the sense of the music becomes more strictly melody and harmony. You can think Mozart, Haydn, and so it's almost like there's like a dichotomy there. It's like, here's heaven, here's earth, rather than like the whole cosmos and its interplay. It's almost like separating the mediators. Oh, I don't need you to pray for me. I don't need Mary to pray for me. It's just me and God. You know, this sort of, it's really like a flattening of the hierarchy. I really think that is.
Really?
And that's part of what makes the aesthetic. Because you really go from this, what the ancients were really trying to portray was the music of the spheres. Maybe I could talk about that for just a second.
Sure.
See what they were getting at. So, do you know the concept of pitch is rhythm or rhythm is pitch?
Please explain.
Yeah, so if you take any interval, you can slow it down until it becomes a rhythm. So you can take those two notes, that interval is called a fifth. And if you were to slow that interval down, I believe this is 3 against 2, then you eventually get the rhythm, because it's just this many hertz over this many hertz. So at a certain portion, it's that ratio. It's the ratio of 3 to 2. And so you could take the ratio of 4 to 3. That's either a third or a seventh, I believe. And so, but every interval at some point becomes a rhythm. And that rhythm is a ratio. So you can think of the ratio as either a rhythm or really as an interval of pitches. And so even Kepler, he viewed the different orbits of the planets around the sun. And even this was like a heliocentric model, but he was still seeing like at its apogee, what is its relation to Earth? Oh, this orbit compared to this orbit is the ratio of 3 to 2. This orbit to this orbit is the ratio of 5 to 4. And so he could actually construct from those patterns legitimate musical intervals. So it wasn't, so the music of the spheres, I mean, it has sort of its like incarnation of sorts in music itself. And we know that there are tones that are produced by each planet, for example. Like there is a rumbling. So, you know, it is a certain frequency. And so that frequency's ratio to another frequency would produce both a rhythm and a pitch. And, you know, this is part of Boethius, the music of the spheres, but it's also super influential, even all the way up to the Baroque. And it's also influential even in organ construction. So they were trying to look at the same patterns, 3 to 2, 5 to 4, and they would build the facades of the organs, the front line of pipes around that same interval. So that then the organ, which would be way up in a loft, often with a root positive or pipes behind the person. So if you were down with the congregation looking up, you might not even see that there was a person up there playing, but instead you would just hear music coming down, specifically air coming through pipes, sometimes which had faces on them, and it coming down, and it was an iteration of the music of the spheres. So they were pretty explicit that this was supposed to recapitulate, in a sense, like the divine harmony of all things. And I think when you start getting into like the Renaissance and this like radical Humean skepticism and all of this, then you start to lose the fact that, oh, we're not actually trying to to incarnate the music of the spheres. Rather, this is, just for entertainment or joy or to provoke the passions or something
pleasure.
like that.
Yeah, just pleasure.
I mean, even in the articulation, the performance practice for the Germans, this was not always the case like in America, but it's a thing I learned when I went to Germany. Like, they viewed different beats as being stronger or higher up than other beats. So they had good beats and bad beats. So if you take like a measure of 4 beats in a measure, well, beat 1 is the strongest, beat 3 is the second strongest, but not as strong as beat 1. Beats 2 and 4 are sort of tertiary, and that's also shown in how they articulate. It's shown in so that you would actually give a little bit of a longer duration to the first beat, and then a little bit of a less duration to the second, a little bit more to the third, but not as much as to the first, and then again less. And so maybe I can just kind of show what I'm talking about. I get this way.
Makes me think of James Brown. James Brown and his first beat, like, was all about the first beat. He would always kind of come back. He would call it, like,
right.
All right, go for it.
So, for example, there's a little bit more of a lilt there than if you just played. Versus. Does that make sense? Can you hear a little bit of the difference?
So you're intimating that within the very structure of the beats, that there's a hierarchy, a mini hierarchy in it there, and that plays itself out at different levels, like at the smallest level, and then in the very concept of the structure itself.
Right, and then everywhere that there's even like a cadence where it temporarily it does that. Not every, that's called a cadence, where you go from this feeling to back home, and you'll have, I don't know, 10, 20 of those in a piece, because you'll be cadencing to a different point, or whatever. Each cadence is not the same either. So you articulate each of those in a slightly different way to show that there's this ultimate hierarchy. So there's a hierarchy of cadential points, there's a hierarchy of beats, there's a hierarchy of the pitches themselves. So the whole thing is intrinsically hierarchical because it's also reinstantiating the music of the spheres.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I grew up, because I'm also Canadian, I grew up listening to Glenn Gould playing Bach, right? And he tended to play things very almost like a machine, like it was just straight. And he also tended to make the counter melody or whatever, the counterpoint, like equal to the melody. So everything was just kind of equal. I remember really liking Glenn Gould, but you seem to suggest that at least originally there was this sense of hierarchy all through the piece, like this understanding of the relationship between the different parts as being always in terms of hierarchy.
Yeah, Glenn Gould is interesting. Most real Baroque purists pretty much hate Glenn Gould. Don't have
he's
time
a modernist.
I don't hate Glenn Gould. Yeah, he's a modernist. I don't hate Glenn Gould. It's a little bit of a testament to the genius of Bach, that it almost doesn't matter what you do with it. It still sounds good because it's Bach. And with Glenn Gould, he did a bunch of crazy stuff with it, but he could play ferociously clean and with tremendous excitement and those, I'd hear him doing these, trills in the left hand while everything else is going on. It's astounding the amount of control that he had, and he had some interesting ideas when it came to Bach. So I'm not totally an anti Glenn Gould person. I don't totally hate everything Glenn Gould did. It's fascinating to listen to his Goldberg variations from the beginning of his career versus the end of his career, because it's almost a super extroverted version compared to a super introverted version. But I don't think anyone would argue that that's the performance practice, the way that Glenn Gould did Bach. It's not the way that Bach would have been originally performed.
There seemed to me one of the things that happened in the 20th century is the idea of the dialectic, and Theodor Adorno and his notion of the kind of this infinite dialectic, this idea that in some ways the dialectic has to be true opposites that just are fighting each other, right? That are combating each other. Whereas in the traditional vision of opposites, there is this sense of hierarchy, right? So there's a sense in which in the opposites, heaven and earth have different roles, and heaven is the center and earth is the periphery, right? And we have the same image of masculine and feminine. You know, the man is the head, the woman is the body, and so the sense that in duality there is hierarchy, right? And it's never a strict opposite, right? We say that Christ has two natures, but that his human nature submits to the divine nature. We don't have the sense of true opposite, you know, in the positive sense, which seems to definitely be a modern phenomena, like this sense of the opposition. We see it even today. Like a lot of the remainders of Adorno's thought are there today, where we have this sense that in some ways the margin is a force that is as tremendous and as is equal to the center, to the identity. And so when we have them pitted against each other, whereas what you seem to be intimating in your vision, even of the point and counterpoint, is that there's a natural hierarchy in the point and the counterpoint. There's a way in which the subject is the subject, you know, and the countersubject is like an echo or a helper to the subject. I don't know if I'm totally off here, but that's what my sense of what you're saying.
You know, it's interesting now that I'm thinking about it. What you're saying, it kind of drives home to me. Like in fugue, it's not as though it's not this dictatorial sort of hierarchy. Like there is a sense where there's perfect harmony between every voice. And so one voice isn't lording anything over another voice. And I get what you're saying, especially with the idea of heaven and earth, of masculine and feminine. Not to bring up a super controversial topic within, you know, I'm Anglican, and within Anglicanism there's a tremendous debate about women's orders. And there's this book written by this guy who's just lambasting anyone who would dare to call into question women's orders, and he does so through calling into all of these patristic quotes about women being below men. I haven't read the whole book, you know, and I really should go back. And hey, maybe Chrysostom said something sexist. I don't know. But I can just imagine if the quotes are, well, this is about, the woman is below the man. And I'm like, well, from a symbolic framework, is earth below heaven? You know, it doesn't, or is earth greater than heaven? Can earth exist without heaven? Or can heaven exist without earth? You know, does one lord over the other? It's sort of the perfect hierarchy. You know,
it's the difference between Christian hierarchy and let's say more ancient or more kind of pagan forms of hierarchy is that our vision of hierarchy is a vision of love. It's not a vision of, like you said, tyranny over slaves. It's a vision of participation and love. And so the idea of the relationship between the heaven and earth is more like a dance. It's more like a kind of giving, you know, heaven gives and earth responds, and it's this kind of proposition and response that we see in the liturgy, you know, the relationship between the altar and the people. And so there are different functions, and those functions are real, and the hierarchy is real. But, you know, we always have to remember that Christ washed the disciples' feet, and that Christ died for us, you know, and that in Christianity we have this sense that the top of the hierarchy or the higher aspect of the hierarchy manifests its height in the manner to which it gives itself to, you know, to those that follow. And so that is of course important to kind of to understand that it, at least I don't know musically if you can hear it, but that, like you said, there's a sense of hierarchy in the music, but that hierarchy is generative. It's generous. It's like it's not like the idea of the subject, which is trying to muffle the counterpoint, right, or to muffle the countersubject, or to like squish it. It's rather this kind of this dance.
No, for sure. I think it's exactly like you said. Christ fills the whole hierarchy. Like the hierarchy it's constant. What kenosis and theosis. It's both pouring out and God's condescension and then bringing humanity up. And so he fills out the hierarchy. It's like it's beautiful. It's love. It's the reconciliation of multiplicity and unity, and that is what a fugue is. That's what great contrapuntal composition is. It's the ultimate reconciliation of multiplicity and unity through the iteration of different ratios and patterns, at different levels. And so I think it's for sure there. The idea of below and above is the thing that kind of
people stick
coming out to me.
It sticks. But so let's look at what in some ways happened, in the modern age. I'd like to hear your opinion of that, because there is a sense of, in many of the movements, the modern movements, in like serialism, I guess, I don't know if that's how you call it, but this idea of in some ways removing hierarchy, right? Or at least making everything equal, or like making every possibility manifest. Like, let's just go through all the possibilities and make sure that they're all there. Or in some ways, like this idea of the liberation of dissonance, or the embracing of dissonance. I'm curious to know what you think, or how you see that related to, let's say, what Bach was proposing.
I think aesthetically you see what happens with the progression from Enlightenment philosophy to postmodernism. I think you see the same thing in aesthetics. You probably understand it way more than I do when it comes to visual art, but you for sure see it in music. But then there's a flip that happens at the end. So let's first get there. With the Enlightenment and this constant, I think it's really with nominalism. I think nominalism by itself sort of destroys the hierarchy, and it says, well, now all there is the nominal and the noumenal and the phenomenal. All there is your experience and the world. And so there started to like seep in this bit of like anti-hierarchy thing around like Kant, which is also happens to be around when like the Galant era and classical music is. You have Rousseau. I mean, Rousseau is pivotal to how we understand identity and how we understand what personhood is in the modern era. Rousseau hated fugue. Rousseau thought that the only good music was that which he considered simple and elegant. And so it was just beautiful melody and harmony, and that was it. And couldn't stand counterpoint. And, I can't stand
Which is what
Rousseau.
we mostly have today, right? It's like the Beatles is just melody and harmony, right? What else is there?
Well, because there is something about that it's not like intrinsically bad. It's just readily apparent. Here's the melody. Yeah. Here's the harmony. It's easy. And you can take a hymn and do it just with melody and harmony behind it, or you can do it, or that harmony itself, you can go deeper and have lines within the harmony itself, and it creates a more beautiful product. But it is what it is. But it's still not counterpoint. It's not what came before. And then John Vervaeke said something I think was fascinating. I would love to know what he thinks about the whole classical era with regards to aesthetics. But he said with Kant, the Copernican revolution of Kant, where before Kant it was that which is real is the heavenly patterns. So as you move into rationality, you move into the real. Whereas after Kant, because of this like radical skepticism, as you move into emotion and to the phenomenal, you move into the real. And so it's not that which shows these heavenly patterns which is more real, but that which is more immediately apparent to, your feelings and sensibility and pathos. And so as the classical era progresses, then you get into the Romantic era, and the Romantic era is all about that. Now there's still, of course, there's still hierarchy, there's still even contrapuntal writing. Mozart himself, who's in the Galant, the classical era, he had to do all of Fuchs's counterpoint exercises, because no matter what, if you're going to write Western classical music that sounds good, you have to have some understanding of how to match consonances and dissonances. But it starts to get wilder and wilder, especially through the Romantic era, and so Beethoven is sort of that bridge from the classical into the Romantic. And by late Beethoven, there's some pretty, the Grosse Fugue is some pretty wild experimentation with stuff. And then as the Romantic era goes along, finally you get to Liszt, and then they start playing with, well, we've taken consonance and dissonance about as far as we can take it. What if we just didn't conceive of some of this as dissonance itself? What if we tried to take the concept of dissonance and sort of emancipate it so that we didn't view things the exact same way? And so then you have the second Viennese school. So you have like Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern. And early Berg is still pretty much in the Romantic aesthetic. It's a logical conclusion of what had come before. Do you mind if I play like a couple lines of the Berg Sonata? So you can hear this is still a little bit romantic. So it's still somewhat romantic sounding. Like there's deep emotion into it, and you can tell sort of at the beginning. This is basically home.
Yeah.
You have these points where you arrive, and
the way they uses dissonance in the first part sounds almost like jazz. It has this kind of emotional dissonance and then a little bit of hint of bringing you back. Definitely.
Yeah, and so there's if there are points where there's home, then there are points, then you have a tonal center, which means ultimately there's a hierarchy of pitch.
Nonetheless,
because
despite it,
despite it. And so seeing that pattern and trying to truly emancipate dissonance, the only real possible way to do that was actually to superimpose in a very totalitarian sort of manner what's called the tone row, which basically meant that then you couldn't repeat any pitch until all 12 pitches had been iterated. I mean, sometimes you'll hear repeated notes, but there's a way it works around that. Ultimately, what you have is these tone rows, and that's called dodecaphonic music or 12-tone music. It's late Schoenberg. You get stuff like I don't really know this piece, so I'm gonna just slightly side read a couple measures. Like, what is that? I mean, there are, and people will say, oh, Matthew just doesn't understand.
No, but it requires huge amounts of effort to care for something that does not have a hierarchy, because that is what attention is. Attention is hierarchy. This is really a meta question that I think none of these people really thought about, which is that attention is hierarchy. It's saying this is more important. I'm going to pay attention to this instead of paying attention to my fraying jeans or to pay attention to, the crack on the wall. I'm going to pay attention to this. And if you're telling someone, pay attention to something through a hierarchy of attention, pay attention to something which is trying to destroy hierarchy, there's something in it that is so unnatural. It's like in the very process that creates a kind of schizophrenic cultural vision where we think in these revolutionary ways, but we don't understand that all of it is necessarily couched, even through attention and memory and care and all these things, in a process that is hierarchical. So it's ridiculous.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's ridiculous it's just ridiculous at the very outset of a project like that. I mean, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting marginally to say, how far can we go? How far can we push? And then people still care about this stuff. But ultimately, it's a little bit of an elite project that doesn't lead very far, let's say. Yeah,
what's weird about it though is it continues on until the 50s. But before I get to that, right? So the way you can make it sound somewhat musical, especially where it's like right before 12 tone and it's 12 tone, is you put phrasing on top of it. And it's all gesture. So Schoenberg, from early to late Schoenberg, because I played a fair amount of Schoenberg myself, like in college, and I don't necessarily hate all of it. Some of the early stuff before it's totally deconstructed and it's totally 12 tone, like the Baroque Sonata is a pretty beautiful piece. It's a pretty dark piece, but there is definitely some beauty to it. But when you get to the 12 tone stuff, the only way to have some semblance of emotion and music is to have really intricate phrasing on top of it, so that you're performing the same gestures that you would be performing in Mahler or Beethoven or Rachmaninoff. And so it's those very gestures that then give some coherence to the music. But what gestures are is, I think gestures are themselves intrinsically hierarchical. So you sort of have to impose this little bit of hierarchy onto it, so that, now we get to the loud point, and now we back off. Like that's a gesture.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And so that's going to a point and backing away from the point. And they realize this too, because then you get to Milton Babbitt, which has some really wild compositions. Let's see, Babbitt post partitions. I cannot play this. This is absolutely insane. But he'll write F, so fortissimo, and P, pianissimo, and then pianissimo, and then the amount of extreme detail that he would get, it's as though they realized we can't, if we really want to be anti-hierarchical and take all hierarchy out, then we have to have a system to impose also dynamic volumes to a absolute equality. Okay. And they even start doing this with rhythm, and you get to total serialism. And total serialism is, it's that radical totalitarian superimposition of order, ironically, that's the only way of achieving the emancipation of dissonance that is, the asserted aim of their project.
It's the order of a bureaucracy is what it is. It's like a bureaucratic order. It's like, here's your social insurance number. Like this is the order. This is, we'd have no hierarchy, but we're going to give you a number, and then everybody has a number. And so it's like this weird mechanical totalitarian system that is installed in order to liberate us from hierarchy, which is hilarious when you think about where it leads.
But it's not, God is able to redeem. God's able to take the most futile endeavors. And it's what you talk about, the flip of postmodernism. How do you, there is that little bit of a secret in there, which is that if no meta-narrative is greater than any other meta-narrative, then it allows for the recapitulation of beauty. So it actually allows for the recapitulation of the greatest meta-narrative of them all. So it allows for a discovery of Christianity itself. It's like in The Matrix, right? So like you talk about, you totally ruined the movie The Matrix for me, by the way. I was totally one of those evangelicals who looked at it and I thought, well, that's Jesus. And it made me super excited. And then you pointed it out that it's actually Satan. And then now as I've thought about the postmodern flip, I thought, but it's also Jesus again.
Okay. Maybe.
In the sense, in the sense of like, what is it doing? It's It's trying to deconstruct hierarchy, and so in so doing, it's in a sense deconstructing like the story of Christ. It's like all these stories where, in an attempt to usurp the masculine, they have to have like the masculine lay their life down for the feminine, etc. Neo lays his life down, and so there's like this sort of parasitic deconstructive aspect to it. but at the same time, the only way that the story itself has any force is if Neo dies and comes back from the dead. So if they're going to deconstruct the story of Christ, they have to recapitulate the story of Christ. So it's like... So Neo is still a Christ figure. There's no way around it, you know?
No, that makes sense. So what does that mean in music? Please, what, like, so let me just say one thing. Let me just say one thing. So for sure, one of the things that I saw happen in postmodernism is that the final emancipation is something like the emancipation of the tyranny of equality, right? So exactly what you said. So in some ways, it's saying in postmodern art, one of the things that happened is that like the music that you talk about, the painting became extremely tyrannical. All you could do was basically paint color field, like one color things on canvases that you know were just these large, like some of the 70s painters with around Greenberg were painting like just they would unroll canvas and just like basically just pour paint on because they had to remove all hierarchy, and so there was almost no way to do it besides this one kind of systematic way. And so what postmodernism did is in some ways said it wanted the freedom to play again with hierarchy, but without hierarchy. And so they basically started to reintegrate hierarchies into the art in weird, ironic ways. But it is this strange opening that you see in the postmodern art.
Yeah, I think the same thing happens in music. You know, this opening of creativity. So I'll give two examples. One is, you know, if you want to fit it nicely into a moment, I think the moment is when Arvo Pärt leaves writing in a serial style and takes, I think it was an 8 or 9 year break, and then comes back, and now he's totally reinvented himself with this tintinnabuli style, or the style of the bells. You know, that would be a point, like if you were like a medieval historian, you would say with Arvo Pärt's Credo in C. Do you know this piece, Arvo Pärt's Credo?
I don't know Arvo Pärt very well. I just know I can recognize the style, but I don't know the pieces very well.
So he has this piece called the Credo. What is it? You know, the Bach prelude in C major, where he starts playing that at the beginning, and then he starts deconstructing it, and it gets wild. It's like a 20-minute piece. It gets really wild, some really crazy deconstruction happening, and then, if I remember correctly, the choir sort of sings Credo on top of it. They're singing the beginning of the I believe in one God, the beginning of the creed. But he just takes that, you know, the prelude in C major, he deconstructs it, it gets to this weird 12-tone stuff, and then it comes back really fast. And then at the very end, the only thing that's left is the orchestra just plays a C. And all there is C. And then he takes his break. So if I was a medieval historian, you know, not worried about every single, you know, variation, or what about this composer who still wrote in serial music in the 90s? See, your narrative doesn't work because of this one guy. Okay? But if I was like Eusebius, I would say with that piece, 12-tone music died. And then when he comes back, Arvo Pärt, he writes in this style where he basically takes one tonality, and then the entirety of the piece is just this slow repetition of several different patterns. And it's ethereal and mystical, and almost everything he writes is on generally an Orthodox text. Almost all of it. It's all these and it's sort of intrinsically sacred. And the irony is that Arvo Pärt is the most performed living composer today. So in this crazy world of decadence, the most performed living composer, precisely because of the ability to basically write whatever you want, because of the postmodern flip, is this devout Estonian Orthodox composer who's just taking the great canon of St. Andrew the Crete and putting it to music. You know, it's insane. You know?
Yeah, that's a great example of what postmodernism yielded.
Right. And to me, Messiaen wouldn't fit into my sort of Eusebius style medieval narrative of how the decaphonic music died. But Messiaen, I think, is sort of also an iteration of this. Now, I know I tried to turn you onto some Messiaen, and you were not the biggest fan of Messiaen. But I would argue that a little bit of what Messiaen has going for him, it does take some time. Whereas, like, I'm not sure late Schoenberg 12-tone stuff, you're ever going to get to a point where you just listen to it and it's super emotional and you'll love it. But what Messiaen did in this world where he had no rules is he just created different languages. And so he created an entirely different harmonic vocabulary. A lot of it was like centered around the birds. So he'd go out into the woods and just transcribe bird song and write little stuff like into his music. He wrote like a whole catalog of the birds. And it's like listening to Indonesian gamelan music or whatever. You know?
Yeah.
At first you're like, what am I listening to? I do not get this. But if you were to live in it for a while, you know, and to devote maybe like 20 hours to it, and then you listen to the Turangalila Symphony or the Quartet for the End of Time or the piano duo The Visions of the Amen or the Messiaen's 20 Watches of the Night of the Infant Christ or any of his organ music, then there's a very similar aesthetic thing to Perret that happens in Messiaen, where he takes you into this like trance state that's like deeply mystical. And like Bach, the majority of the stuff Messiaen wrote was also, it was Christian and theological, and it was centered around the church and super influential. And so I know at first, if people just go listen to Quartet for the End of Time for the first time, I mean, if you can sit there and listen all the way to the end, I don't know how you can listen to the middle movement and the last movement and not feel something, because there's something that sounds slightly off, you know, but it's still beautiful and mystical. But there's definitely some weird stuff in there, you know. But I think Messiaen is a little bit on the continuum to the more crazier side, but he also sort of inhabits that same space of the postmodern flip, that we now don't have these rules, so let's return to Christ.
Yeah, that's amazing.
You know,
man, this has been a great conversation, and I think it's definitely brought me closer to kind of getting the music and understanding, and it makes sense. So thanks for coming on, and everybody check out the new album. You know, if you're really into music, it is worth getting the CD. It has a wonderful booklet on the inside with more of some of my art, and then a wonderful text by Matthew right at the beginning, and it's in French, in English, and German, and so it's great stuff, and a great picture, like really good looking picture of you right there. And so so everybody check it out. And Matthew, thanks go ahead.
I just want to say thank you for letting me use the, your cosmic image on the cover. And the whole reason that I wanted to use that image, that I thought of that image, was precisely because this piece for Bach, it's his longest organ work, it's his most mystical organ work, and it's the piece where he goes through all of the chorales that correspond to the essentials of what he perceived to be the Christian faith. So it's his magnum opus for the organ, and it's very like spiritual and catechetical, and precisely because of that, it's like, well, what image is going to correspond to that? Because this piece literally covers everything, the baptism, like the Gloria. I mean, it's Christ's birth, his death, his resurrection. It's like the whole life of the Christian. It's like all put into music for Bach. So the only fitting image would be an image that's also an all-encompassing image that then also shows, the fractal patterns of the music of the spheres. And so your image is perfect for that, because there's only one cosmic image that I can think of, which is the one that you created. And I mean, I guess now the one by Aidan Hart that he's now done. But your image is perfect, and thank you for putting it in color and for letting me use it.
No, it's a joy. People don't know this, and we're going to end with this story, is that Matthew has been there from the very beginning. Matthew's actually the very first person to recognize me in public. Where I walked into a church, it was Holy Ascension in Charleston. It was in 2017 maybe, or maybe even 2016, right at the very beginning. And I walked out into a coffee hour and I hear Jonathan Pageau, The Symbolic World, and I turn around. And here's this giant strongman guy with wax mustache wearing suspenders. And I was like, who is this guy? And since then we've become good friends. I've actually stayed at his house for weeks on end. And so it's a great joy to be able to participate. And it's an honor that you asked to use my piece of art. I really appreciate it. And wish you all the best, Matthew. Thanks for everything you've done.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.